This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm a member and I encourage you to become one too. Membership is extremely reasonably priced and comes with a host of benefits. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. At the time of recording, Elizabeth Ellis's Australian Animal Law Context and Critique has only just been released. I know lots of animal lawyers are regular listeners and will be tuning in today, so I encourage you to take a look at the Animal Publics website. Also, a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce you to Dr Saskia Stucki. Saskia is a Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, Germany. Listeners may be familiar with her work in animal law and animal rights, though she also works on human rights, climate law, and environmental law. Today, we're going to talk about her paper, Animal Warfare Law and the Need for an Animal Law of Peace, a Comparative Reconstruction. Now, at the time of recording, this hasn't been released yet. It's forthcoming in the American Journal of Comparative Law. Welcome to the podcast, Saskia.
Hi, Josh. Thank you for inviting me.
Can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on this topic?
So, I've been previously working on both animal welfare law and kind of analyzing its shortcomings and structural deficits, as well as kind of working on the theory of legal animal rights and kind of theorizing the conceptual foundations of that. And I always kind of thought of animal welfare law as the present legal framework that we have, and animal rights as the kind of the ideal utopian future legal framework for governing the legal protection of animals. But I've always kind of felt something was missing. There was kind of it seemed too simplistic to me, this rigid dichotomy between animal welfare law now, animal rights future, and this infighting between the welfarists and the abolitionists. So I always felt there was something missing, and this missing link connecting the two fields kind of came to me by coincidence when I read an article or a paper on international humanitarian law, or specifically the humanization of international humanitarian law. And I noticed, it has nothing to do with animals, of course, but I noticed while reading that chapter how, for one thing, how similar the law of war is with animal welfare law. I'll get into that later, I guess, but there are very interesting similarities between the law governing warfare, which is international humanitarian law, and animal welfare law. But I also realized that there's very interesting or a similar tension between international humanitarian law and human rights. And I thought, okay, well, this is kind of a similar situation as we have between animal welfare law and animal rights. So this kind of inspired me to try to embark on this comparative journey to kind of find a way out of the welfare rights dichotomy by comparing this field with the field of human rights and international humanitarian law, and trying to kind of reconstruct animal law in a way that mirrors the international laws of war and peace.
Now, I definitely want to ask you about this comparison between warfare and animal welfare as two areas of law. But before I get to that, I want to point out this idea that you're using or you're drawing upon of the war against animals. Now, this is something that we've talked about on Knowing Animals several times. And each time I think the question arises, what exactly does that mean? How exactly are you using this idea of a war against animals? And how literal is this idea?
I'm still split on whether I subscribe to the notion that humanity is waging a literal war against animals. I'm kind of, on the fence here, and I in my paper I remain basically agnostic as to this question. It's not relevant to my analysis Well, actually, I don't think we are waging a literal war against animals. But I think it's helpful to phrase the violence, the systemic institutionalized violence that we put on animals in our systems of animal exploitation, to phrase that as a war on animals in a figurative sense, because it highlights and spotlights the sheer violence that is involved in doing so. But that's actually not even the most relevant point for me, because I'm analyzing it from a legal perspective. Just talking of a war on animals just kind of linguistically helps to keep that analogy between the law of war and animal welfare law kind of on the reader's mind.
Great. So let's think about this relationship between animal welfare law and the law of warfare, because they sound like very different things. So could you explain why you think there's this clear analogy between them? What similarities are there between these fields of law?
They are different things. They are very distinct legal fields. We have international humanitarian law, which is the body of international law that governs warfare, so the conduct of armed hostilities. And we have animal welfare law, which is actually a legal field in domestic law, and which governs on a kind of on a ahistorical reading the welfare of animals, but on a more accurate interpretation. It basically governs the exploitation of animals, as a secondary function therein, it maybe also governs the welfare of animals to some extent. So these are two very different fields of law. Legal comparison is possible as long as there is some kind of shared substance between two different legal fields. And in this case, the starting point for this comparison is that both these different legal fields govern an inherently violent institution. So both international humanitarian law and animal welfare law have historically formed as a response to a pre-existing violent institution. On the one hand, war, the institution of war, and on the other hand, the institution of animal exploitation. And both these institutions which the law governs entail violence of a specific kind. This violence is inherent, it is instrumental, it is collective, and it is institutionalized. And there is actually not many other bodies of law, of modern law, that govern or that have as their object not the elimination and prohibition, but the regulation and kind of moderation of lethal and extreme collective violence. The best historical example I can think of is slave law, but that doesn't exist anymore. So I think international humanitarian law is actually the best body of law to make this comparison with. And then there's like, the deeper you go into this analysis or in this comparison, the more similarities I found. In both bodies of law, we have this tension, this kind of dialectical tension almost between two diametrically opposed motives, basically. So on the one hand, allowing violence, because both bodies of law have evolved around a violent institution. They are premised on the existence of a violent institution, so they have to allow the violence that is necessary to sustain that institution. But then on the other hand, there is kind of this humanizing impetus. So both the international humanitarian law and animal welfare law, they seek to some extent to peripherally humanize these inherently violent institutions of war and animal exploitation. And then both also operate with the key principle of unnecessary suffering. Most people will have heard of the principle of unnecessary suffering in the context of animal law. Interestingly, it's also a core principle of international humanitarian law. And finally, it's also very interesting to look at the critical discourses surrounding both these areas of law. So critics have formulated very, very similar criticisms about basically how the humanization of violence also legitimizes and reinforces the violence. So we have, on the side of international humanitarian law critics, we have the pacifists, basically, who say, okay, just regulating warfare, that just serves to legitimize war. We should abolish war and be pacifists. And the same, of course, we have in the context of animal law as well. The most prominent critic is Gary Francione, who basically says that any kind of animal welfare regulation just serves to reinforce the exploitation of animals, and that animal rights and abolitionism is the only acceptable position.
That's fascinating. So that clearly establishes that there are these points of comparison between these two areas of law that on the face of it are quite different. What is the benefit of engaging in this kind of comparison? Or to perhaps put it in another way, what does this do for animals?
This comparison, this analogy gives us a new perspective, a new outlook on this kind of very, I don't know, stalemate situation, this welfare rights dualism, this impasse. Based on this analogy, I propose to reconstruct animal law, to not just have either animal welfare law or animal rights, but for the first thing, to think of animal welfare law and animal rights as complementary and not mutually exclusive. So human rights and international humanitarian law are very different areas of law, but they are complementary. They can apply at the same time, and we have human rights and we have international humanitarian law. And I think we should think the same way about animal welfare law, which governs the war on animals, the metaphorical war on animals or violence against animals. And we can think of animal rights as a complementary peacetime regime that governs peaceful, non-violent, non-exploitative human-animal relations. And I think to move away from this rigid dichotomy and towards a complementarity makes it more feasible and palatable for animal rights to actually emerge as a legal regime. And we see that already happening in the last couple of years. Numerous courts around the world have started to recognize legal animal rights. So we already see animal rights emerging slowly, timidly in global case law. And I think thinking of animal welfare law and animal rights as complementary makes more sense as an explanation for this. Basically, the legal protection of animals is governed dually by two regimes, by animal welfare law in exploitative situations and by animal rights in or against exploitative situations. And then the analysis or this analogy with the law of war and peace also spotlights, on the other hand, what is missing in animal law so far. So the field of animal law or the kind of the current legal framework for animal protection is very undercomplex, basically. Animal welfare law is the only or the primary designated regime that is tasked with protecting animals. And that's absolutely not sufficient, because if we think within this analogy, that means that animals are actually in this ubiquitous war. They're forever caught up in this war. They only get protection within this war, but they don't have any legal protection against the war or like beyond the war. If they're not in a warlike situation, there is no legal regime protecting them basically in peacetime. So that's why I call this a reconstruction of animal law. So I suggest to reposition animal welfare law as a designated wartime regime, and in parallel to construct this missing animal law of peace, which is, for one thing, the prohibition or like an analogical prohibition of the use of force, which in the human context prohibits basically aggressive wars or starting wars, as enshrined in the UN Charter. And a similar kind of fundamental norm is needed for animal law too, some norm that determines under which circumstances and conditions collective violence against animals is allowed or legitimate. So kind of when can we legitimately wage a war against animals, if at all. So we need to restrict the instances where a war against animals can even be started or maintained, and at the same time create instances of peace with animals. And then the second kind of part of this animal law of peace is animal rights. So kind of the ideal type of governing the fundamental interests or protecting the fundamental interests of animals in times of peace. And I define basically peace with animals as the absence of the war, so non-exploitative, no collective violence against animals, and basically in respect of the intrinsic value of animals, of their own interests, and so kind of harmonious human-animal relations.
Well, that's fascinating. There's so much going on here, and this is a brand new way of thinking about our legal relationships with animals. I'm intrigued by this idea of the law of animal peace, and I'm wondering, is this something you envisage as part of international law? Because as you pointed out before, international humanitarian law sits currently in international law, whereas animal welfare law sits, I think, entirely within domestic law. So there is a disanalogy there between these. So are you envisaging moving this into the international sphere, or are you envisaging that an animal law of peace or an equivalent could be part of the domestic sphere?
My work is primarily conceptual. This paper is really kind of a step before what you're addressing. So it's really kind of just rethinking, reconceptualizing, trying to find a way out of this impasse, the welfare rights impasse, and kind of presenting a new way of designing animal law. Then the follow-up question is, okay, like how do we implement that? I think it works on both the domestic and international level. So obviously, for now, animal law is primarily located on the level of domestic laws, and that would mean that in addition to the animal welfare laws that most countries have, yeah, we should work on implementing norms, defining norms that prohibit certain forms of animal exploitation, what Gary Francione would probably call incremental abolitionism, and working at the same time also at implementing fundamental animal rights. But then, as other scholars such as Anna Peters have highlighted, because animal exploitation is by its nature transnational, transboundary, it doesn't suffice to only operationalize animal protection on the level of domestic law. We need to universalize legal animal protection and the protection of animal rights. So there has to be this additional international law layer that would somehow mirror this international law of war and peace split as well.
Do you think there will always be a need for animal welfare law in the sense of warfare law? And by that I mean, do you think once we have realized animal rights and we have an animal law of peace, perhaps this is blue sky thinking now, do you think there would still be a risk of us going back to war with animals?
I mean, ideally, no. Ideally, there would be no war on animals, and hence we wouldn't need an animal welfare/warfare law. However, realistically speaking, I mean, if we look at the human context, wars are prohibited in international law, and yet we still have an abundance of wars going on all over the world. The most recent example, yeah, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So even though wars are prohibited, wars still happen. And I think, and in that sense, yes, there is also still a need for international humanitarian law, because as long as war remains a factual, an ugly but factual reality, it's better to address it and alleviate it somehow than to just completely let it be its worst kind. And I think a similar logic applies to the animal situation as well. We can outlaw the war on animals. We can outlaw normatively any kind of animal exploitation. We can live the animal rights utopia, but realistically speaking, that would still not prevent 100% of all the exploitation that animals, it might significantly reduce animal exploitation, but it will certainly not prevent any kind of collective violence against animals. So I think for those residual instances where humans or human collectives, part of societies, still resort to kind of exploitative violence against animals, it's better to still have some kind of warfare regulation in place than to just let it be. I mean, we see, for another example is a slavery, which has been outlawed and is not regulated, right? And we have more slavery nowadays than ever before when it was legal. It's just illegal slavery now. But so I'm not advocating here for regulating slavery, but it is a problem. Slavery has not stopped to exist. It still exists, and there is zero legal protection in place for slaves who live and die today. It's a problem between the normative ideals that we aspire to and the ugly mess which is our reality sometimes.
What routes do you think there are from where we are now to realizing this animal law of peace?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer would be transitional justice. I mean, that's the route that we, or kind of the framework that we talk about in the case of human wars, the transition from war to peace. Yeah, we phrase that as transitional justice. I think similar principles can be developed for animals, but it's of course a monumental enterprise because this war on animals is so ubiquitous and omnipresent, and it doesn't look like anytime soon we're gonna tackle it in any concerted way. It seems like a overwhelming idea or task to steer us as a society away from waging this omnipresent war against animals and trying to construct some kind of peace with the animal kind. But I think any step, what I suggest in my paper is, while we should not discard animal welfare law as completely useless, I kind of try to rehabilitate animal welfare law as an ugly but necessary legal regime. I think our focus should definitely be on developing these missing two parts of the animal law of peace. So the fundamental norm prohibiting or significantly curtailing the legitimacy of the war on animals, and animal rights as peacetime regime, which as peacetime regime will also share in kind of this, in trying to prevent the war on animals.
Now, Saskia, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, that was Peter Singer's Practical Ethics, and that was when I was 15 years old in high school in my bioethics class.
Peter Singer is a very common answer on this programme, but it's very exciting to hear you were reading him as a 15-year-old. I think that's a lot earlier than most of us encounter pro-animal thought.
Well, I have my biology teacher to thank for that.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, that was a chapter in a edited volume, and it dealt with the animal person. So I tried to construct a legal personality for animals, kind of as a third category besides the natural and the juristic persons. So yeah, I termed this the animal person, and kind of it was a legal theoretical piece.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, that's tricky. I would say Singer for obvious reasons, or Gary Francione, or Will Kymlicka, but these are all men. And even though there are so many women in the field of animal studies, for some reason, male faces tend to be the most dominant ones. So I want to name a female scholar here, and that would be Anne Peters, who has, on the one hand, both been very influential with her work on global animal law, but for me personally also, she has been a great mentor. I've worked for and with her for over 10 years now, and she's been an excellent mentor, and has also showed me how, or been a role model for being a rigorous and responsible academic.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
As academics, it's important for us to speak out, speak up, and be courageous, but also honest, to always act and write with integrity. I think it's important for us to mainstream and legitimize the idea of animal rights, or of or spotlighting the injustice towards animals, and legitimizing and mainstreaming ways of addressing that injustice. And it's also important, I think, for us to not get caught up in intellectual, or just solely operate in an intellectual sphere that is completely detached from reality. I think we always need to kind of link back to the real life suffering that we're trying to address.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, I want everything. I would change. I would move from a culture of cruelty to a culture of compassion, or in the terminology of my paper, I would say, to transition from the war on animals to peace with animals.
And what are you working on next?
So I'm just finishing my new book, which is called One Rights, Human and Animal Rights in the Anthropocene. So that should hopefully be published in a couple months. It's basically, it tries to integrate human rights and animal rights under a holistic shared framework that I call One Rights, and kind of analyzes human and animal rights not as independent instantiations of fundamental rights, but actually rather as indivisible and interdependent rights. And then I'm also working on a more political project, I guess. So it's defund meat. So I'm trying to tackle the meat question, which is kind of the elephant in the room in many climate debates, or the sacred cow, I guess. So I'm trying to tackle the meat question from a public health and environmental and animal perspective. And I think we need a political movement that should be called the defund meat movement. So that's what I'm working on next.
How can people find out more about your work?
Well, they can Google me. That will lead them to my homepage, where I always keep my newest publications up to date. They can also follow me in academia or on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Saskia_Stucki.
Well, thanks so much, Saskia, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you, Josh, for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter @knowing_animals or on Facebook @knowing_animals. You can also follow me on Twitter @JoshLMilburn or on Instagram @aveganphilosopher. Please do tell others about us and review the podcast where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.